Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. Before I start with the usual intro, I want to make a few short announcements. Firstly, starting with the next video, I will switch between season specific and general videos. So one video will be about a specific year, for example top 10 fan cards in 2021, and then the next video will be a general one again across all the years like this video is. This has two main reasons. The two general lists I've made so far, including this one, have been heavily dominated by older cards, especially from Z1, because those cards had more time to generate points. Season-specific lists circumvent that problem and should allow newer cards to have a better chance. Secondly, it also saves me time. I always try to get a clear overview about which decks a card was played in at what point, how many copies those decks played, and which cards it was combined with or good against. If cards topped a lot of events, like all the cards on this list did, that takes a ton of time. Season-specific lists mean that I have to look at way less deck lists, which means I need less time in the long run. That's the only way I can keep up with the bi-weekly schedule I have right now. In addition to this big change, I have also two small changes. Firstly, I will change the layout a bit starting with the next video. I will try to find a folder that fits the topic of the video instead of always using Sandstorm Titan. Sadly, we don't have a lot of full arts, but I think I should find a fitting one for most topics. And secondly, starting with this video, I will cut the honorable mentions. This is another measure to reduce my workload a bit, and I would also like to keep the videos a little bit shorter. If you want to know how close a card you expected to see missed out on making the list, you can always ask in the comments and I'll try to answer it there. On that note, I also want to encourage everyone for this video and all the future videos to write their guesses for what makes the top of the list in the comments. With those announcements out of the way, let's start with the top 10. In this series, I will talk about 10 cards with the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case, they have to be a targeting removal spell. For that, I compiled a list of decks the top 10 official DireWolfDigital event or reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on a point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. The tiers are either based on how far the deck went or on how important the event was. For a more detailed explanation, check out the introduction video on my channel. Today we are looking at spells that remove units from the field. I decided to split a group of removal spells up in two main groups, spells that target and spells that don't. Something like Feeding Time belongs into the first group because it targets a unit, while Harsh Rule kills units without targeting, so it cannot appear on this list. I count every spell that can kill, transform, or put a unit into the deck as removal spell, so cards like Polymorph or Edict of Grodoth have a chance as well, even though they don't explicitly kill a unit. I also count every spell that can deal damage to a unit as a removal spell because it can theoretically kill a unit, even if it only deals 1 damage, so cards like Condemn or Seer could appear on the list too. This means a ton of cards are legal for this list, many of which have been stapled for years because most decks are interested in at least some ways to answer the opponent's units. That makes this list a lot more stacked in terms of points than all the previous lists. Just for perspective, the worst card on this list would have taken the number 1 spot in 3 out of the 4 top 10 videos I've done so far, and the second place in the one video it wouldn't have taken the first place in. And that worst card on this list is Blazing Salvo. It's a 2-power, 1-fire influence rare fast spell that deals 2 damage to a unit. It also allows you to swap a card from your hand with a 2-cost card from your market. It was released as part of a fast spell cycle with market access in set 8, Echoes of Eternity, at the start of 2020. That made it legal for most of the 2020 expedition season, in which it made most of its points. It was a staple in Rakano Acro, Stonescar, Skycrag and FPS Dragons, FTS Sacrifice, and Braxis Acro before it got its first nerf in May of 2020. Right after the release of the Shadows of the Spire campaign that gave a huge push to fire decks with cards like Jack Mercenary Hunter and Aurelian Supplier. But a small nerf to also deal 2 damage to yourself did barely affect the playability of the card, and it remained a staple in fire decks, especially aggressive ones, till the end of the 2020 expedition season. Salvo was also a huge boost for aggressive fire decks in Throne, most importantly Stonescar Acro, Skycrag Acro and Skycrag Yetis. It was especially important for the latter because the deck already played a high amount of free drops for an Acro deck, so being able to replace clunky merchants with a cheap removal spell was great. In 2021 it remained successful in mostly the same decks in Throne, as in 2020, which led to a second nerf towards the end of the season, increasing its cost from 1 to 2. That nerf hurt a lot more, which is evident by the big decrease in tops in the 2022 season. Next up we have Equivocate. It's a 2-power, 1 primal and 1 time influence uncommon fast spell that puts a unit into its owner's hand and then transforms it into a random unit of the same cost. It was released in the Dead Reckoning campaign in early 2018 and had an immediate impact on the ETS season of the year as a central part of TGP aggro, TGP control and Elysian midrange. The combination of tempo-efficient removal, because people played a lot more units that cost 5 or 6 back then, and transforming the unit into something that was usually way weaker, sometimes to the point of almost being useless, made it very attractive back then. The same reason still applied for its strongest season, 2019. In that year, it was an important card for FTP Peaks, a midrange deck with powerful top end like the name-giving Howling Peak and Heart of the Vault, which used to be a 6/6 back then. Drawing Equivocate with Heart could lead to strong board swings and turnaround games easily. It was also a staple in Elysian Maul decks, a deck that remained widely played into the start of the 2020 season. Bouncing cards back to the hand was especially good there because it meant Maul could deal more damage. In 2020, it had a bit of a drop, but it was still a staple in any deck that could play it, most importantly even Elysian towards the start, and Elysian Spells or Elysian Charal towards the end of that season. In 2021, it still saw some play in FTP aggro and Elysian Spells, but both got crucial nerfs, which led to a weak 2022 season for Equivocate. On rank 8 we have another card that was part of a cycle, Edict of Makar. It's a 1-power, 1-shadow influence uncommon spell that prevents an enemy unit from blocking the turn you play it. But if that unit is Justice or Shadow, it kills the unit instead. It was released in Z7, Flames of Skulta, right before the start of the 2020 season. It started at Expedition Season strong as a market card for 2 tier 0 decks in a row, first seen in Cultists and then after that Archimport midrange. Additionally, it was a market staple in Stonescar and FPS Dragons and TGS Control. In Throne it was also mostly played as a market card, which makes sense because it is only good if you can consistently kill something with it. Its most important homes in Throne have been Stonescar aggro from 2020 to 2022, sometimes in Condemn markets, Felon Reanimator in 2020, even Felon in 2021 in Vinecrafter markets, Stonescar Seal in 2021 and 2022, and FGS midrange in 2022. Its playability always varied a bit depending on how many good unit-based Justice and Time decks were around, but the cheap cost made it good enough to at least see some play in markets in most formats. On rank 7 we have the exact opposite of Edicts, Slay. It's a 3-power, 1 Justice and 1 Shadow influence uncommon fast spell that kills a unit, and it was released in Z2 Omens of the Past in July 2017. Instead of the very cheap but specific Edict of Makar, Slay is a more expensive but very flexible removal option. That made it attractive for a wide number of mostly mid-range decks throughout the years, especially in the first 3 seasons of Eternal's competitive history. In 2017 and 18 it was a staple in Archimport midrange because while it did cost 1 more power than both Vanquish and Annihilate, it could kill units that those two missed. Vanquish missed units like Archimport Instigator because he has less than 4 attack, and Annihilate missed units like Tough Rod or Heart of the Vault because those are not single faction units. In the same years it was part of FGS Armory, which slowly transformed into FGS midrange over time, the most played deck of the early 2019 season. Slay was a staple in that deck, but there was a clear trend to cut it down from 3 or 4 to 1 or 2 copies towards the middle of the 2019 season. That downward trend in playability continued across decks in Throne until it got buffed from slow to fast in late 2021. Partly because decks with its influence weren't as widely played anymore, and partly because threats got cheaper and cheaper over time, which made a 3-power 1-for-1 removal less attractive. The buff to fast speed and the release of Black Book Pit Boss in early 2022 led to a slight resurgence in FGS and Archimport midrange decks in Throne though. On the other hand, in Expedition, it only really had success in 2022, where it was played in Archimport midrange, FGS Unleash and Archimport Minotaurs. Next up we have Defiance. It's a 1 power, 1 justice influence uncommon fast spell that either kills an attacking enemy unit with cost 3 or less, or stuns an attacking enemy unit with cost 4 or more. It was released in the set with the same name at the end of 2018, right in time for the 2019 season, in which it had an impressive showing. In that season it was a staple in Horror Control and FGS midrange, or for the latter rarely played 4 copies, and it was occasionally played in Horror midrange and Rakano Aggro among many other decks. The flexibility of the 2 modes meant that you always had a target against any unit based deck, but of course it was a lot better if it could consistently kill a unit, which meant it was especially good against aggro decks. That flexibility was deemed too strong by DireWolf and led to a nerf right before the start of the 2020 season. After that nerf it could only kill 1 and 2 drops and stun everything above, and that made the card a lot less attractive because it meant it missed important threats like Champion of Chaos in Stoneska Aggro and all merchants and smugglers. But even with that nerf it was still good enough to see some play in Archenport, FGS and FTJ midrange at the start of the 2020 season. DVD decided to revert the nerf in April 2020, but the play rate still dropped quite a bit in the following months and years, and some widely played Justice decks, most importantly Horukira, rarely played it. In Expedition, it saw sporadic success over the years in different Justice midrange and Control decks, for example in Horror midrange in 2021 and TGP Control in 2022. On rank 5 we have another 1-cost removal spell, Suffocate. It's a 1 power, 1 shadow influence uncommon spell that kills a unit with 3 or less attack, and it was released in set 1, the Empty Throne, with the game's release. Suffocate is another good example for a situational but very efficient removal spell, which means its playability can depend on the format, but it is efficient enough to have seen at least some amount of play in most formats. Its strongest season was 2017, the first one, where it was played in a majority of shadow decks, most importantly Stoneska Burn, Felon midrange, Stoneska midrange, and towards the end Xenon and Archenport midrange. There was a trend to play it in the sideboard instead of the main deck towards the end of the season though, and that downward trend continued into 2018, in which it was mostly played in the same decks as in 2017, but a lot more sporadically. Suffocate's fall continued in Throne, culminating in a very weak 2021 season, but at least it made a bit of a comeback in 2022 in Archenport and FGS midrange, and Stoneska Seal as a cheap answer to cards like the aforementioned Black Book. Similarly to Defiance, it was part of several Expedition formats and got some tops here and there, for example in TGS midrange and Stoneska Aggro in 2020, and in 4 and 5 Factions Ling in 2021. Next up we have the next set 1 card, Vara's Favor. It's a 2 power, 1 shadow influence common spell with lifesteal that deals 1 damage and draws a shadow sigil from your deck. It's part of a 2-cost favor cycle, all of which draw a sigil of the faction from their deck, which is very strong in Eternal because the mulligan guarantees you 2 power, so ways to draw additional power that cost 2 or less can consistently prevent missing the 3rd or 4th power, and most decks outside of extreme aggro decks usually want the 3rd and 4th and often even more power. Vara's Favor is by far the most successful card out of the cycle, because it has the potential to be a 2-for-1 by killing an enemy unit, removing an Aegis, or by killing a relic weapon. That ability and flexibility made it a staple for all kinds of shadow decks in Throne until around 2019 and 2020, most importantly Stoneska Burn and Stoneska, Felon, Xenon and Archenport midrange. In those early seasons it was very helpful at picking up fire aggro units like Onel Ronin and Pyronite, but also ramp dogs like Initiate of the Sands or weapons like Auric Runehammer. But the play rate in Throne dropped consistently over the years because better ways to prevent power screw got released, like exploit or shadow etchings, and because it became harder to justify paying 2 for such a minor effect when the game got faster and faster. Vara's Favor got some time to shine in the Expedition season of 2020 and 2021 though. In 2020, among others, as part of the aforementioned Tier 0 decks Xenon Cultist and Archenport midrange, and in 2021 in a wide array of shadow midrange decks like Felon or Xenon. On rank 3, we have our 3rd Justice spell on this list already, Vanquish. It's a 2-power, 1 Justice Influence uncommon spell that kills a unit with 4 or more attack, so the exact opposite of Suffocate. It was also part of set 1 and it had the strongest 2017 season out of all the cards on this list, even better than rank 2 and 1, which, spoiler warning, are also from set 1. In the year, Vanquish was played in almost every Justice deck because it could kill a large number of units that often cost at least twice as much as itself, like Sandstorm Titan, Vara Fate Touched, Mystic Ascendant, and towards the end, the all-around scene Tough Rod Auric Broker. The play rate of Vanquish dropped a little bit in 2018 and 2019, but it was still a staple in a variety of decks, for example Archenpot Midrange, Rakano Aggro, FGA's Midrange, and Horror Control, although some of them opted to play it in the sideboard or, after the release of Merchants in mid-2018, in a market. That staple status led to a nerf from 2 to 3 power at the end of the 2019 season, which resulted in an abysmal 2020 season because there was just no reason to play it over better alternatives like the aforementioned Slay, Pristine Light, or Defiance. The nerf got reverted at the end of 2020, but at that point it wasn't enough to replace better cards like Pristine Light or Bring to Justice and Throne. Vanquish also didn't see a lot of success in Expedition, except for a few tops in set 8 flying crescendo markets while it was still costing 3 power. On rank 2 we have our third set 1 shadow spell, Annihilate. It's a 2-power, 1 shadow influence uncommon fast spell that kills a single faction unit. In 2017 and 2018 it was played in almost all shadow decks because it was the most efficient removal spell available if you wanted to kill big units that Suffocate missed. It couldn't kill all important units, for example it missed Champion of Chaos and Tough Rod Auric Broker, which Vanquish could usually kill, but in contrast to Vanquish, Annihilate could remove smaller units like Teacher of Humility. The release of the 5 missing champion and strong powerful multi-faction units like Risen, Great Bar Master led to a slight decline in 2019, but it was still played in most shadow decks like Felon Scream, FJ's Midrange or Stonescar Aggro, although often only at 2 or 3 copies in contrast to the 4 copies that most decks in 2017 played. In 2020 it had a strong start in decks like FGS and Archenpot Midrange as an efficient way to deal with cards like the DD, the Killing Steel, but it dropped a bit towards the end of set 8, where it was mostly played in Stonescar Aggro, its most consistent home post-2019. It had a second strong patch in 2020 after the release of set 9 in June of 2020, thanks to the strength of Even Seen in Midrange, which was the most played deck in 2 consecutive Throne tournaments. It was especially important in the second Even Seen in variant as a way to answer the Severin plus Reap combo in a mirror match. Killing Severin in response to Reap not only got rid of Severin for 4 less power than he used to cost, because at that point he did still cost 6 power, but it also prevented a crease from getting played at all, because Severin was not on the board anymore to see the influence gain from Reap, so the search effect couldn't trigger. So you got a 2-for-1, and you even played less power than your opponent had to play for their combo. In 2021 and 2022 it saw a little bit less play, partly due to better alternatives existing like Send an Agent for Xenon, and partly because the multi-faction legendaries and rares from set 9 like Hadra the First Seal or Seal Cabal Strongarm became more and more important. Annihilate was only part of set 9 Expedition, in which it saw a fair amount of play in decks like Archenpot Kira, TJ's Midrange and Stonescar Aggro. And the number 1 is, I'm sure most of you guessed it by now, Torch. Torch is a 1-power, 1-fire influence spell that deals 3 damage to a unit or player. And like the last 4 cards, it was released in Z1, The Empty Throne. I haven't checked it yet, but I'm pretty confident that Torch is the non-power card with the most points and tops in the history of Eternal. Maybe it still is the number 1 card, even if you include power cards. From 2017 to 2019, it was in more decks than Fire Sigil by a decently significant amount, which means it was in almost all Fire decks. There are some, I think in 2018, there were more decks with Fire Sigil, so there are definitely some Fire decks that didn't play it, but it was in almost all of them. Additionally, it was almost never played at less than 4 copies in those 3 years, and almost always in the main board instead of the sideboard. The sheer efficiency of it made it attractive for every kind of deck, no matter if aggro, midrange, control or combo. It was also very flexible. It could kill smaller units, kill bigger units that you already damaged with something else, remove eaches on units or players, kill relic weapons, or just deal some burn damage to the opponent's face. The fact that it was fast back then meant that it could also be used to make your opponent guess which fast spell you have. For example, if you have Finest Hour Torch in your Arcano aggro deck, because that leads the opponent having to think what to play around. It could also be used to save quick draw units in combat against bigger units, and to kill things at the end of the opponent's turn, or in response to spells like Finest Hour or Mirror Image. That was changed with the nerf to slow speed in late 2019, but it was still the best removal spell in the game after that, proven by the consistently high numbers of tops until 2022. Some fire decks started to drop it though, in 2020 only sporadically in Arcano Influence, but in 2021 and 2022 more commonly in decks like Skycrack Sling, Stonescar Seal and FJS Midrange. The majority of those 3 decks never played Torch or played a few copies less than 4. But the addition to Set 12 Expedition at the end of 2021 and start of 2022 allowed Torch to prove its sheer power once more. In 2021 it saw some success in the last few tournaments of the season, but a real show of strength came in 2022. It was only Expedition legal for the first tournament of the year, but it was a big reason for Arcano aggro's success in the tournament, and it was part of almost half the list that topped that event. So to summarize, I would still call Torch a powerful staple, even if it isn't part of every fire deck anymore. This marks the end of the 5th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. You can find the introduction video and all the previous episodes on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.